All right. In studio, Mr. Eric Wilhelm. Thank you for
Greetings,
coming in. I
of course.
appreciate it, brother. All right. One of my favorite topics is weather. I mean, everybody just loves paying attention, especially when you get the threat of a snowstorm coming in the weekend. Everybody gets super fixated on the happenings. So give me a little bit of your backstory. Where'd you come from?
I'm an Ohio native. I was born in southwest Ohio, actually in the town of Xenia, which is famous for a big tornado back in the 70s. And I was born right after the blizzard of 78. So I've always kind of said that, I was born to be a weather guy since I'm from Xenia and I was born right after one of the most famous blizzards in Ohio history. I grew up in New Philadelphia, about an hour and a half or so southwest of here. Got my degree from Ohio State in meteorology and spent the first 11 years of my career kind of in the private sector, not in TV necessarily. There's a company called AccuWeather. That's over in the middle of Pennsylvania, and learned a lot over there. And I was more of a radio guy over there as opposed to being on camera. So I sat in a little booth, kind of like sitting at a table like this, talking into a microphone, doing the AccuWeather forecast for cities all over the country. So I got pretty familiar with a lot of the U.S. Geography in places that I've never been to before. So I spent 11 years there and then just decided to try something new and try to get back a little bit closer to home, and been here in the Youngstown area since late 2012. So this will be going on 12 years this year.
Man, okay. Yeah. And you've got such a voice for what you do. Have you done other speaking things? It's been radio and TV pretty much your whole time? Pretty
much, and I kind of developed that weather guy voice being on the radio. It's not like I was born necessarily with some sort of broadcaster voice, but you talk on the radio long enough, you're just going to develop, especially when you're being formal and talking about weather and doing your job, you're just going to develop that voice naturally, I think.
Yeah, and it's so soothing. Like, you can be the worst news in the world, what's coming, and I'd be like, I'm going to listen a little further, a little deeper.
It helps that people aren't turned off by the way you look or the way you sound. That certainly helps with everything.
Yeah, and you have quite a social media following with what you do. So you're good at marketing. You're good at social media, I'm assuming?
I got into social media back in the late 2000s around the rise of Facebook and Twitter, and I found it as a way not necessarily to kind of talk to people necessarily at first or broadcast things, but get information. It was a way for me to be in touch with what's going on in the weather and the world and all the things I'm interested in. And as as my career has kind of blossomed here in Youngstown, I've used it more as a way of me broadcasting things out into the world. It's a way for me to reach people that I couldn't reach otherwise. So particularly Facebook, got a pretty big audience there. Social media is an important part of my job because it's 2024 now, and let's face it, a lot of people are not waiting until the 6 o'clock news to get their weather information.
Right.
Everybody's walking around with a phone in their pocket these days, and to reach the largest amount of people possible, you can't just rely on people tuning in to the local news anymore. It's not 1984; it's 2024 now, and so you got to reach people where they are.
Yeah, and it's awesome because instead of doing a 5-minute stint on the news, you get a long form platform to explain in great detail what's going on.
Yeah, and it's not just Facebook, Twitter, even though that's kind of on the decline these days. But a lot of people are on Instagram. I'm not as much on the ones that a lot of the kids are on these days, the Snapchats of the world and the TikToks and things like that. I'm a little too old to really be totally plugged into that universe, but I try to be on as many platforms as I'm comfortable being on to reach as many people as I can. And especially, it's that time of the year. It's the winter. The weather tends to be kind of important at this time of the year, even though the last couple of years have been kind of lame overall. But we're into that time of the year where I can reach a pretty big audience if we've got a big ticket winter weather event.
Heck yeah. And now comparing us to the rest of the country, are we a boring weather town or are we pretty active?
When it comes to severe thunderstorms and kind of tornadoes and severe weather and things like that, we're definitely less active here in our region than Western Ohio, out into the other parts of the Midwest, the Plain States. Eastern Ohio, Western PA, we get our fair share of severe weather, but I wouldn't say it's a hotbed of severe weather. When it comes to winter weather, it's a pretty busy place. We get a lot of snow here in a typical winter. We're close enough to the Great Lakes that it's a pretty active few months usually. although the last couple of years have definitely been an exception.
Yeah, I don't know what they would do in parts of the country like Southern California where it's like today is the same as yesterday and the day before that.
There are markets like that for sure. San Diego springs to mind as a place that if you want boring weather, that's the place to go for sure. Now, it rains sometimes in Southern California. They have interesting weather sometimes when it comes to wildfires and things that are kind of weather adjacent, if you will. But yeah, the day-to-day, especially like from, say May to October, clouds and fog in the morning, sunshine in the afternoon.
You could pre-record it for the next day, right?
Pretty much could.
And so you, over the years, you've probably gotten access to even better technical tools to get a better insight in things. So kind of tell me about that evolution.
Yeah, we have amazing tools at our disposal now. And, I'm young enough that I wasn't around back in the 60s and 70s when, weather forecasters had basically one maybe computer model to look at total. Now we have dozens and dozens of weather models at our disposal. I'm going to go into work here this afternoon and ascertain what's going to happen this weekend and next week by looking at literally a dozen or more weather models. All of them have different strengths and weaknesses. When it comes to kind of weather awareness as to what's going on right now, we've got beautiful high-res satellite imagery now that we didn't have before. We can see down to, very, very fine detail what's going on with clouds and precipitation, of course, high-res radars that weren't available 30 years ago. And even when I started in this business 22 years ago now, things seem pretty archaic now, the way they were in the early 2000s. That doesn't seem like that long ago, but in terms of the advancements in weather technology, it's really a lifetime.
Yeah, and are you in weather mode like all the time? Because you have no idea when it's going to happen. And I see you pop up on social media at every hour of every day, honestly.
I have a hard time getting unplugged completely.
Okay.
That's part of, I think, our job. If you want to do it well in this day and age, going back to the idea that you can't just be on at 6 and 11. People want their weather information at all times of the day. And if you want to be their source, if you want to be the one that they turn to, that means you got to be available at 9 a.m. or 10 p.m. or even 4 a.m. if the weather dictates. That's just the way it is if you want to do this job well. But I do unplug. There are times of the year that are quieter than others. Early fall, September, October tends to be a pretty boring time of the year. And so those are some of the times of the year that I find myself able to kind of really step back and take a little mental health break sometimes. And I actually just had one of those over Christmas break. Thankfully, the weather was warm, it was pretty quiet, and I had a lot of time off work at the end of December, and I was able to kind of pull back pretty nicely. Unlike last year when we had a huge Arctic blast and ice and a little bit of snow right around Christmas time. You may remember Christmas of 22, the wind chill was minus 30 on Christmas Eve. And even though I wasn't technically working then.
You were working.
I was working.
Yeah. And I guess it's probably like doctors and lawyers, everybody you run into is like, hey, Eric, how's the weather forecast for this weekend, right? So you never really are able to disconnect.
Just on my way over here this afternoon, walking from WFMJ to this studio this afternoon, I was stopped on the street. Hi, how you doing? Nice to see you. I feel like I know you. I'm not big into the the celebrity part of this job and being on TV and things like that. It's not a big priority for me necessarily, but it's kind of cool to be recognized in a positive way. Being in the public eye comes with some negative things too. There's a lot of haters on social media and things like that.
Really? I could not ever see someone.
Believe it or not. But the truth is, most people are extremely nice, and I really enjoy interacting with a lot of people. So,
all right, let's talk about that modeling because that totally interests me. And you've got some of those models go over on the deep end and they over predict, and then you got some that are under predict. Like, do you have a favorite one that you pick?
Not necessarily a favorite. I've been doing this long enough that I know the different strengths and weaknesses of the models to a fair degree. The one that gets the most buzz as being the best model overall is the European model. It's run by the Europeans, of course, and the reason for its superiority in a general sense, traditionally the Europeans have dumped more money into their weather modeling than we have here in the U.S. Now that's changed some in the last 5 years or so. We've kind of caught up some, but even though we've been playing catch up and we've done a little bit better, in general, the European model will outperform a lot of the American models in a general sense. Now, there's going to be certain storms that the European stinks. The GFS, the American kind of version of the European model, it does better sometimes. But that's maybe 2 or 3 out of every 10 times. The other 6 or 7 or 8 times out of 10, the European's generally going to be superior. And the two models I just mentioned, though, those are kind of medium and long range models. You can look at the next 10 days on those models. We have models that really just also focus on the next 18 hours, and they update once an hour. They're really updated a lot. That doesn't mean they're the answer key, doesn't mean they're always going to be right, but it's a nice tool to have, a constantly updating short-term model. Those kinds of things are really useful in severe thunderstorm situations in the spring and summer. They can have some use in the winter too, but it's really nice when you are tracking a potential line of thunderstorms, say in May or June, and you have a rapidly updating model to look at every hour. It can be a nice tool to have.
Now, is artificial intelligence coming into play where you can get some historical context and some probability factor that roll into there?
It's starting to. We're very early in that process, but there are some AI-trained models starting to become available. They're experimental at this point. They're a little hard to find. The average weather hobbyist out there is probably going to have a hard time finding them, but they are starting to become available for meteorologists to take a peek at. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see an explosion of those kinds of models that are trained on past events more than kind of the physical equations that tend to govern most of our weather models. Weather models are based on a lot of physics and math, and that's where their output is derived from. When it comes to AI, a lot of them are going to be trained on they're going to be fed a bunch of historical weather information and trying to predict the future based on mostly that historic information as opposed to the physics of the atmosphere. So it'll be really interesting to see how they perform, but I do think that that's going to explode.
Yeah, I can see if it creates a profile of what storms do when they're over this specific area, like there's a region that has less elevation and you see something fizzle out or something like that, it can take that as a data point.
Yeah, and I suspect 20 years from now when I look back, the technology we have here in 2024 is going to also seem kind of archaic, just like the technology at the beginning of my career now seems archaic. I suspect AI is going to really dominate a lot of weather modeling in 20 years, and we're going to look back at the 2020s as like, boy, that was the dark ages. So when we didn't have AI.
When you guess, coin flips sometimes, right?
Sometimes.
All right, so in the last couple of big storms that we had come through here, we're really heavily, this is going to be a terrible one, and they kind of fizzled. So what's been recent about those kind of dumping out at the last minute around here?
A lot of it is kind of random chance. There's not a physical reason. There's not a topographical reason. It doesn't have anything to do with our proximity to the Great Lakes or mountain ranges or anything like that. Sometimes it's just a game of chance. And yeah, the last couple of years, in general, the pattern has been just too mild for a lot of storms. But the threats of storms, yeah, there's been a handful, including this upcoming weekend, that have been, ones that have kind of done a little head fake on us, where it kind of looks like it might be something, and then as we get a little bit closer, it kind of doesn't become something. And sometimes it's just a matter of 50 miles, 100 miles. In the short term, just a few hours to our east, there's going to be 5, 6, 7 inches of snow this weekend in central PA, eastern PA, places like that. And that's not that far to our east. And a little jog 50, 100 miles to the west of that storm track would put us back in, maybe a pretty sizable storm. So sometimes it's just it's a game of chance, and it's kind of random how the atmosphere tries to behave. And sometimes we're on the other end of the stick. There were winters back in the early 2000s, 2010, 2011, where we seem to get every single storm and be in the sweet spot for every single storm. So the atmosphere has a tendency to kind of balance things out, and our day will come before too much longer, I'm sure, where it just seems like we can't get away from the snow.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'm a big space exploration guy. And so, we're going to be heading to Mars. We're going to be considering creating atmosphere there and creating our own weather. Now, what's your belief in having some controls on weather and changing weather patterns and the technologies that go along with, like, if you've got an area where a tornado could wipe out a town, you can combat tornadoes and stuff like that. What do you think?
I don't think that in my lifetime we will ever have the technology to have an influence on the small scale tornadoes and things like that. I can see where there will be some use to guiding big scale things like hurricanes away from land. There's already some science in that field, but I could see sometime in the next few decades where we have some ability to influence the track of a hurricane, which instead of hitting, say, southern Florida, just scoots out to sea by 10 or 20 miles, we might be able to just nudge it a little bit. But I don't foresee a day where we really have the ability to control weather on a small scale, influencing a thunderstorm to go here instead of there, or a tornado to go here instead of there, things like that. So.
And when you see these things depicted in movies or whatever, do you take exception with bad science that goes along with any of this?
It depends on how serious the movie is trying to be. If it's trying to be a serious movie and they get all the science wrong, that's pretty irritating. But if it's a campy, fun, whatever kind of a movie, then I don't take it seriously.
Which one out there got it really right? Like the Twisters, were they pretty accurate?
For the 90s, the Twister was pretty accurate for that time. Now, looking back 27 years later, there's a lot of bad science in that movie. But at the time, based on where the science of storm chasing and severe thunderstorms and things like that, based on where that science was in the mid-90s, it wasn't bad at all. Then there's things like Day After Tomorrow and movies like that are, they're pretty crazy, but they're also a little more tongue-in-cheek. Twister was a fairly serious, science-y kind of a movie. A lot of fun, and influenced the career of a lot of meteorologists. There's a lot of meteorologists younger than me, by a little bit, who became meteorologists partly because they were fascinated by Twister.
Yeah.
They got into weather because they saw that movie and thought, boy, that's kind of interesting. I'll look more into that. And there's a lot of meteorologists who owe their career to movies like that.
And can you assure me that Sharknado is not a possibility?
It is absolutely not a possibility. Speaking of tongue-in-cheek, goofy, campy movies, I think I saw the first one. I haven't seen part 28, but the first one is pretty good.
So long-term weather patterns. Are we getting a good handle on how, I hear things about like the North reversing with the South and Ohio becoming, a warm weather climate. Do you see any of that stuff possible?
I think that over the next 100 years, Ohio's climate will, 100 years from now, it may resemble more like Atlanta than Northeast Ohio, which means shorter winters, hotter summers, that sort of thing. The effects of climate change in our part of the country are a little more muted than coastal areas. Places like Miami and New York City, places that are right along the coast, definitely have bigger impacts from climate change, at least right now. For us, it's a little bit more muted. It's a little harder to notice, but we've seen an increase in precipitation in the last few decades. Now, the last couple of years have been an exception. It's been a little drier, but the long-term trends, we definitely see more precipitation than we did before 30, 40 years ago. When it comes to snow, now the last couple of years have been an exception, of course, but even our snow trends have been up. A lot of people remember the 1970s, these horrible winters, so much snow and so much cold, but actually our winters in the late 2000s, early 2010s were much worse. And in general, our snow on a seasonal level has been increasing in recent decades.
When I was a kid, we had snowmobiles. It felt like snow was around forever, and now I feel like snow doesn't linger long enough to actually have fun in it anymore.
And there's part science to that. There's part just everybody remembers their early years when it comes to weather, especially a little bit differently. Even me, a trained meteorologist, someone who quote unquote knows better, I look back at my high school years. Boy, all the snow back then. And, we were off school for days. And the truth is, you look back at the weather records, and no, that wasn't the case necessarily. But everybody remembers weather, particularly snow events, because it involves being off school and involves lots of fun, things like that. Everybody remembers fondly certain things from their childhood when it comes to winter weather. But the truth is, in our area, it actually snows a little bit more now than it did a few decades ago. Last couple of years are the exception.
Right. So this might not be in your purview, but I'd like to get your opinion on it. So like having like sun and solar activity and how it affects things, we're expecting a Carrington event sometime in the future. And so do you ever see modeling in that area?
It's not necessarily, I don't have a lot of domain expertise when it comes to that stuff. I tend to think that when it comes to our weather on Earth, it has a lot more to do with our kind of internal in the atmosphere system than anything going on in outer space, solar-wise or anything else.
Okay, and the La Niñas and El Niños thing, I remember they exist, but I don't quite remember how they affect us here. Is it one's on the East Coast, one's on the West Coast?
El Niño and La Niña both have to do with what's going on in the Pacific Ocean.
Okay.
And it's a specific part of the Pacific Ocean, right near the equator. El Niño is the warming of a stripe of water along the equator in the Pacific. La Niña is the opposite, the cooling of the water there. Both things kind of compared to average, so it's warmer than average or cooler than average. And the oceans and the atmosphere kind of play in the same sandbox. In other words, they play with each other. The oceans can influence the atmosphere and vice versa. And so when you have an El Niño or a La Niña, that's going to make the jet stream do certain things. And because both those phenomena are over the Pacific, and what goes on in the Pacific tends to drive what's going on downstream over where we are, over North America. We can say with quite a bit of certainty that both La Nina and El Nino have certain impacts on our weather, particularly in the winter season. That's when both of those phenomena tend to peak. They tend to peak December, January. And a lot of the impacts of both of those things have to do with how strong they are. A weak La Nina does not behave the same as a strong La Nina. Same thing with El Nino. There are lots of other things that go into seasonal forecasting around here, but those are two big ones, and they both have to do with what's going on way out over the Pacific, where you think, what in the world does that have to do with our weather? But everything's connected, and the jet stream is impacted by what's going on in the Pacific Ocean.
All right, so I look at the Farmer's Almanac, right? Mm-hmm. And there's something to it, but there's something I'm fascinated by it. Like, what is that based on?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. When it comes to the weather forecasts.
Okay.
Now, the Farmer's Almanac has a lot of cool stuff in it. A lot of fun facts and figures and, fun stories and gardening advice and all sorts of stuff like that. But when it comes to the weather forecast part of it, it's for entertainment only. It's a little bit like getting your news from the supermarket tabloid.
Right.
It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun, but you don't want to use it as like a serious source of news. And so when you open the Farmer's Almanac and it says, and you pick up this thing in August and it says, oh, it's going to be harshly cold from February 2nd to February 8th, and snow's going to be above normal during that week. You can't take that seriously. There's no science behind that at all. I rag on the Farmer's Almanac sometimes because there are certain people who will defend that thing to the death.
Yeah.
They will tell me that I'm full of it when I tell them that the Farmer's Almanac weather forecasts are just for fun. And you should rely on, actual science and
data measuring, that
things
kind
like
of thing.
That. But I will get some pushback from people, particularly an older audience who kind of maybe grew up a little bit more with publications like that, because let's face it, they didn't have much else to look at. And so they're used to kind of relying on the Farmer's Almanac, even though every single year it probably let them down if they relied on it or made decisions based on anything in it. But yeah, when it comes to the weather forecasting and that thing, it's fun to look at, but that's about it.
Similar to like people set things on the Zodiac, right? Yes. They buy into these things and say, oh, I'm going to have a great 3 weeks. And then maybe the power of suggestion connects some of those things a little bit.
Yep, that's also true. It's amazing what people will hold on to sometimes.
For sure. And back to the sort of the weather controls, the areas that are more arid, you got the deserts being able to make it rain in certain places and whatever. And I heard a lot about that when I was a kid, and you don't quite hear about that anymore. Was there some real science behind that?
Very little. And there might be a day where cloud seeding and things like that become a little bit more of a necessary thing because of climate change also continuing to make drier places drier. So places where a lot of people live, Phoenix, Arizona, and places like that, there's millions upon millions of people. And that climate may not be habitable in decades down the line if we don't do something to increase the precipitation. So it may come to a point where we're kind of forced into having to try to at least influence the weather a little bit to make it so you can still live in places like that.
Yeah. So I've heard you say a number of times that you would rather, on the side of caution, give the worst case scenario so that if there's something dangerous, people can at least, prepare for it. So let's talk about the weekend storm, and what is the worst that you can see it being?
At this point, we're 48 hours out, and honestly, the high end of this is only a few inches, and even that doesn't look very likely. Everything's been trending a little bit farther to the east. This is not a big wound-up storm. It's kind of a flat wave that's moving across the mid-Atlantic, and there's going to be places that get quite a bit of snow, even though this is not the most impressive-looking storm in the world. So northeastern Pennsylvania, parts of New York, parts of New England. There's going to be some football games this weekend that'll be snow games. That'll be kind of fun to watch.
Those are my favorites.
Yes. But for us, the highest end I could see is a few inches. More than likely, it's going to be a coating, an inch at most, or something like that. A nuisance. Now, that being said, if you have a reason to be on the road Saturday afternoon, evening, you still have to use caution.
Yeah, for sure.
Even a half an inch to an inch worth of snow. Sometimes those events can be the trickiest because people don't adjust their plans. When we have a 6 to 12 inch snowstorm coming, a lot of people stay off the roads. They adjust their plans. They don't go to work. They don't go to school. When we're calling for a dusting or half an inch or an inch, people tend to just do whatever.
Right.
And things can still be pretty slick. And so sometimes we see more accidents and more problems in those really nuisance minor events. So we try not to downplay them too much, even though in the grand scheme of things, is a half an inch or an inch of snow all the snow in the world? No. Actually, we saw a little bit of this morning. We just had a little coating of snow out there this morning, but we had some accidents. A little bit of a glaze of ice last night, a little candy coating of snow on top of that, and some people had some problems.
Yeah, you go without it for 8 months, you forget what it's like, and then you got to kind of be more cautious in the beginning till your brain warms up to it.
We've certainly not gotten used to winter weather, that is for sure.
That's right. Are you a skier?
What's that again?
Do you ski?
I am not a skier, no.
Okay, so I'm looking to I'm trying to be a skier, and so the weather hasn't been very productive for skiing just yet. How's the winter season look?
I think the back half of winter will be great for outdoor winter recreation of all kinds, including skiing and some of the resorts around Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. I think late January and February will be markedly different than last January and February, and quite a bit different than we've had so far this winter as well. So the next week to 10 days will be kind of generic vanilla January cold, colder than December, but nothing crazy. But the end of January and into February, I think, has a lot of potential to be the coldest and stormiest period we've had in at least a couple of years around here. So when it comes to skiing, I've never even tried it, but there's just something in my head I can't get around going down a hill on these boards and being out of control. That just I have a hard time being comfortable with that.
Yeah, and it's not better than you're thinking either. It really is a scary proposition, and being out of control is a wicked feeling.
Snow tubing is about as adventurous as I've
gotten. There you go. I'm good at that.
Tubing.
I'm totally good at that. So I read an article about Lake Erie having the least amount of ice on it in this time of year, whatever. How's that affect things going in? Do you get more moisture even if you've got a little ice?
You can. The lake water temperatures are still cold at this time of the year. We're well into winter now, and so it's not like the lake is still in the 50s. The water temperatures are in the mid 30s, but yeah, there's no ice. So the lake is open for business, as we say. And so if you get a cold enough air mass over those waters, yeah, you can still see lake effect snow and things like that. It's only when the lake completely freezes over that you can pretty much shut off the lake effect snow machine. Even if you have some ice, but some open areas, you can still have lake effect snow. It's all about the temperature difference between the air that's blowing over those lakes and the water. And even though the difference might be smaller when the lake is in the 30s as opposed to the 50s, you can still get a pretty big difference. If the air mass is cold enough, you can still pick up some lake effect snow. So yeah, as long as we don't freeze over the lakes, and I don't think we will over the next couple of weeks, the right setups can still produce some lake effect for sure.
All right, so let's put your science mind to use, Sarah. I'm trying to figure this out. I do this every once in a while with when you get in your car and your windows fog up. I can never figure out whether or not I want to blow hot air at it or cold air at it, because hot air holds more moisture. So blowing cold air at it, wait, maybe not.
Well,
we're doing some math here.
Yeah. And it's always interesting, too, when the inside of your windshield fogs up, right?
Yes.
You put on your wipers or you try to clear out the outside and nothing happens, and it's because there's actually a little layer of moisture on the inside. And, yeah, it's all about differences in both temperature and moisture.
Okay.
And so usually hot air is the one you want to go with to clear out fog and your window from fogging up in the mornings and to melt off, of course, the frost and things like that. But it is interesting sometimes how that works, and I find that a lot of times the inside of my car will fog up if I've been out and about throughout the day and have warmed up the inside of the car, and then the car sits, the air inside cools down, but there's still moisture in the air. Even though you're cooling off the air, the amount of moisture inside the car is still elevated, and so as the air temperature cools, you get saturation, you get some fog inside of your car, and that to me is just the worst because you can't clear it out with your wipers or anything like that.
Right.
It's just kind of a pain.
Now, I hit you with that one because sometimes I'll watch your streams and you get the wackiest questions get lobbed at you and you try to answer them. You're just such good spirited about it. And you try to come up, even if it's not in your wheelhouse, you're a good sport about it and try to answer it.
I try to. I take it as an honor when someone chooses me to ask a question of. There are times that the questions can get overwhelming whenever I'm covering severe weather and things like that. They just roll on by. There's just no way I can get to them all. But when I can, I try to answer as many as I can. Again, it's an honor. There's a lot of places to get information these days. You can Google a lot of things, but the fact that they're asking me,
exactly.
That's nice. I take that as a badge of honor, and I try to answer as many as I can for sure.
And what's in the future for Eric? What's on your big plans?
Well, we're going to get through this winter, and I'm looking forward actually to being challenged a little bit when it comes to the weather over the next month or two. The last couple of winters, I feel like my my skills when it comes to winter weather forecasting have atrophied a little bit because we just haven't had that much. And then once we get through that, we're probably going to have a more active severe weather season this year than over the last couple of years. So I think that even though the weather has not been real eventful of late, I think that's going to change in 2024, and I'm just going to keep plugging away. I just came to a new agreement at WFMJ, so you're not going to get rid of me anytime real soon.
Congratulations!
Thank you,
See, that's when in this area, usually bigger markets try to poach our best talent out of here into bigger ones. So like, you're sticking with us. Thank you for that.
I am. You know, I'm an Ohio guy, and I met my wife in this area, and she's from this area, and we got no plans to go anywhere anytime soon.
Beautiful. So how do people find you on social media? Where we can look you up?
So on social media, if you just in Facebook, or just Google, if you just search Meteorologist Eric Wilhelm, you're going to find me there.
Chief Meteorologist.
Yeah, put
Eric
the Chief
Wilhelm
there. But even if you don't put the Chief, you'll probably find me. Eric WFMJ on Twitter/X and Instagram as well. And then our app, I think, is the best weather app you can get for our area. The most important thing when it comes to our app, which is the Storm Tracker 21 app, unlike a lot of apps that people rely on, including kind of just the default weather app that comes on your phone, a lot of people rely on that. Unlike those kind of apps, our weather app is human generated. All the forecasts you see in there, we typed those things in. They're going to match what you see on TV, and you'll find a lot of detail in there. We can type a paragraph if we want about tomorrow's weather, and it's just stuff you're not going to see if you rely on a lot of other apps. So I really recommend everybody download that app. When it comes to weather forecast, there's going to be times that we get it wrong, and it's fine to admit that. And if you rely on any weather app at any time, sometimes it's going to get some things right, and sometimes it's going to get some things wrong. But I like to think that more often than not, our forecasts, including what you're going to find on that app, are going to guide you in the right direction more so than.
And nobody's ever thrown milkshakes at you because you got it wrong.
Milkshakes, no. Maybe other things, but not milkshakes.
All right. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate you being here, bud.
My pleasure.